Surtsey Island is a small volcanic island about 32 kilometres off the south coast of Iceland. And it's a new island, somewhere between sort of about 1963 and about 1967, if I remember rightly. This island was formed. And it's different because it was a hands-off, lay-off sort of island, and it's been kept as a pristine natural laboratory, free from all sorts of human interference. And what this has been doing is studying how plants and some animals have started to move in on this island. This is the process of succession, which I want to have a look at in this little video. So since about, I suppose about 1964, scientists have recorded the arrival of different seeds brought from the mainland. Now, most of these will probably have arrived by bird or perhaps carried by the ocean. There's also the appearance of very simple things like moulds, bacteria, fungi, all carried by the wind. And then we've got the first sort of vascular plants sort of arriving at around about, I think it was about 1995, was sort of the first sort of shrubs sort of trying to appear. And by about 2004, so this is sort of 30 years after the event, then we've got quite a few lichen fungi growing there. Quite a lot of birds have arrived, and we've got a lot of those that breed obviously in Iceland, and they've now found this island, Surtsey, to breed on as well. But there are some that aren't necessarily indigenous to Iceland. And we've also got some invertebrates managing to survive there. So let's have a look at some succession and see what it is and how things sort of work. So our first thing is we've got to get some pioneer species. So our pioneer species are going to be largely our moulds, fungi, lichen, things like that arriving fairly early, perhaps algae, sort of fairly sort of simple sort of creatures. And these are the creatures that can cope with probably no soil. And once these have started to grow and manage to survive, then what's going to happen is they're going to die. And as they die, they produce some soil. And this is going to allow our next layer of creatures to arrive and survive. So these molds, these fungi, lichen, algae, they're producing soil, but they will break up the rock. And that will also produce some soil. And once we've got here, then basically we've got more wind-blown seeds. So we've got sea and wind, and I suppose largely bird carried sort of seeds will arrive, and they can start doing something, start growing. So how quick did it appear? Well, Surtsey Island started appearing literally from the sea in about 1963. By 1965, we've actually got the first sort of growth. So we've got the first plants, and even then it wasn't until 1967 that the island stopped erupting, well, largely anyway, and so it wasn't even giving time for some plants to sort of survive, because they'd be overtaken by volcanic sort of activity. So succession needs various things. We've got to try and get this habitat here to improve, and basically as it improves we can get larger, taller plants can colonize, and as they come in then more animals can come in. Although this is an island, so it's going to be fairly difficult for many animals to come. Birds, yes, but other animals going to be a lot more difficult to try and come in. So Surtsey is kept as a highly controlled, isolated island, so that people aren't allowed to sort of go there. It's kept so we can get lots of biotic succession as the abiotic features change. It's prohibited to go ashore, to dive nearby, to disturb anything going along, and this way we can manage to use this natural experiment to try and work out what's going on. There's another story of succession, and this is more akin to our American folk, who probably remember in about May the 18th 1980, Mount St Helens volcano, which is in Washington state, exploded. There'd been a lot of earthquakes before that, but then there was this sudden explosion. There was pyroclastic flow, which I remember watching on the television. This flow destroyed virtually everything. Well, I'd say virtually everything. Let's say everything in its path, because although basically the blast zone around Mount St Helens was barren, it was lifeless after that 1980 eruption, some plants and some animals did in fact survive. Some fish covered in ice lakes managed to survive. Some salamanders hibernating in the mud survived. Some seeds such as willow and maple were sort of wiped out, but their roots survived, and after a while some of them could start to sort of push up and sort of start growing. Now they're not a lot, there's few and far between, but after just a little while there's a little bit of life appearing around Mount St Helens. So what sort of things go on there. Now, although some things did survive, generally nothing did. Generally. And so we've got an area around a volcano, and up to a limit things are destroyed, and then there are plants and animals, and gradually those plants and the animals on the very periphery start invading inside. So the wind's going to blow small seeds, and algae, fungi, other things are going to get blown around. We're going to have those light seeds. Some of them might be able to grow. We do know that volcanoes are pretty sort of fertile ground, which is why a lot of people live near them. The light seeds blown in. Heavier seeds, they'd have to be carried by birds, hitchhiking in. And once they've arrived in there, then they can become the centres of new life for the survivors and the colonisers. So about 50 years on at Mount St Helens, there are still many large areas which are sort of basically deserts. But other areas are little oases. We've got some animals coming back in. They say the elk, which were incinerated, have now moved in, and in fact are in greater numbers than in their pre-1980 populations. Now, why? Lack of predators. So we've got quite a lot of plants coming in, these pioneer species, and then once we've got those pioneer species in, then we start to get these sort of secondary species starting to come in, because the first ones had started making a little bit of soil. They'd started enriching that soil with a bit of nitrogen, and that's going to allow other things to come along. Plants, they can defecate, they can leave their nitrogen around, and now we're starting to get little hot spots of these areas growing with small little plants, groups of plants growing, and this is going to basically attract animals, the small mammals, the birds to come in, and gradually this area starts to turn back to as it was. So quite a few people have studied this, because of we've had Mount St Helens, we've got Surtsey and other places that we can look at what goes on and how things change. So although we've got an invasion of these plants and we've got an establishment of the vegetation over the last 30, 40, 50 years, it's going to take several hundred years for things to return to where they were before Mount St Helens exploded, or before, well, you can't really say what Surtsey would be before, but to be more like perhaps the mainland of Iceland. We're going to have a forest gradually growing around Mount St Helens. It had a forest around it before, and it takes time for this forest to grow, to establish itself. We've got to get the plants growing and then dying, and then the next generation and possibly the next or next generations occurring before we get what we had before. So we see the arrival of different sorts of fir trees, the ones that sort of lived there before. They've got to get their seeds in, and it's all right if they were still around the peripheral, but if they weren't, then they've got to be gradually moved in by birds and other things. So we are looking at plants basically acting as our pioneer, and then that's going to attract more as a way of small invertebrates, and then the vertebrates to prey on those, and gradually things start to change. So we've got this idea of succession, of how things gradually change, of how we move from one sort of barren environment to a fully biotic environment. Now, once we've got these pioneer species, then we need to get then further succession, and this is going to be things like small things like the mosses. These are now going to basically help to hold water, because largely these places are deserts when they sort of establish, and once we've got that, we get larger, taller species moving in, and as they move in, these then attract everything that's going to feed on them, and there'll be the invertebrates. The vertebrates are going to come in. Now, where it is makes a difference. If we have, for instance, a mountain, then usually somewhere along the place we'll have a tree line where nothing is actually going to survive. If we've got a water line, then the sea level, then we can only get certain plants are gonna survive above this sort of level. And what we're looking for with all this further succession is reaching a climax community, and largely this generally means trees. We're looking at this as the basic, the apex, if you like, successor is going to be the tree, and basically the dominant species here is going to influence what the environment's actually going to look like. So in England, where I live, then we're looking at probably the main dominant tree, I would have thought probably was an oak tree. It's the one that comes to mind to think of what we look like round here. But if we don't get there for one reason or another, like above a tree line, sea level, various other things, then we can actually achieve a climax community without the trees, and this sort of makes for a more interesting setup, I suppose. So we've got the pioneer species, the succession coming in here, and then this further succession, which I suppose we could call here secondary succession. And this is where the bare soil has been cleared already, and we start getting, as long as there isn't too much human interference, the re-establishment of the forest climax community. I suppose in this way that we've got something like the Incas when they disappeared from Central America. Their whole cities were swallowed up by the forest, and trying to return to this forest climax sort of environment that existed. So we've got to think about seeds widely dispersed by the wind. We've got to think about rapid growth of plants. Short life cycles help the establishment, and we've got this idea that we must need and have an abundance of seed generation production so that we can get something happening. Doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes something happens to make our life a little bit more difficult, and this is called deflected succession. Most of the time this is called by human intervention. As I said, I live in England, and we think of England as being, well, what do we think about it? England's green and pleasant land. We think of lots of fields and pasture, lots of grass growing. Going through the sort of countryside, I see lots of hedgerows, which makes England different to many countries that we have these hedgerows, these little oases of natural sort of England, because that's what we would look like without the human intervention. Humans are ripping up trees. No, that tree can't grow there, it's the middle of my field. They rip up all the indigenous species growing, and they grow what the farmers want to grow. But if you leave it, the hedgerows start taking over. Near me where I live, there's a garden. Now the people who own this garden, I don't think they go into the garden. It started off when I moved in as a lawn, a place where a family was, but no longer. The grass has long since gone. Shrubs have taken over, small trees have taken over, and it looks like a wilderness. It's returning to what this would look like. Nearby me I've got a river, and here we've got a small floodplain and a meadow. Here they allow sheep, cattle, horses to go on the moor and sort of graze. And what this does, this keeps the trees from growing. And what we get are lots of wild, pretty flowers growing because it's maintained in that way. But if we leave it, it will return to forest. This is what England is. It is a land of forest. If you and I had a little walk there some 10, 20, 30,000 years ago, then England's green and pleasant land would be trees. It would be a forest land, because the trees would have taken over as the dominant species, and instead of having a few forests, this would be a land of forests. When the first people came here, that's what they did. They cleared some of the forest to make places where they could grow their crops, where they could survive. Now sometimes doing that, it doesn't make an awful lot of difference to the environment, and other places it does. We hear and we see about large places like the Amazon chopping down, burning down big bits of forest, and as they do that, the problem comes that they replace it with not necessarily suitable plants. They might want to grow cattle, sheep, they need pasture, but maybe the land isn't suitable for that. And although it might be suitable to support trees and a rainforest, it might not be suitable if we've got lots of grass. It'll survive for some years, but it won't survive for that long. So succession is important. We've got this idea of how things happen and when things happen. Let's have a look at this in a little bit more detail. So if we look at our stages of succession, to sort of highlight these in perhaps a little bit more sort of way, we've got first of all our pioneer species. Now pioneer species have got to have certain features, so let's look at what features that these pioneer species have to have. Well, many of them are going to be and have asexual reproduction. Largely because this is fast. This single organism can rapidly multiply to build up a large population. This population needs also to have a lot of wind dispersal if it's going to really do very well. Doesn't have to have necessarily seeds, but thinking of all the organisms here, we've also got spores, and so things can reach these isolated situations, as we mentioned, Surtsey. We need to have rapid germination. We can't afford to sort of hang around for too long. Basically, on arrival, these organisms have got to get out and do something. Photosynthesis has got to be really one of those important things. The plants aren't going to manage to get much from what little soil there might be, so the ability to photosynthesize, light's normally going to be available, whereas other foods are not. What can help is if they can fix their own nitrogen. There isn't much in the way of nitrogen around, so if they can fix their own, this is going to make the world of difference. And these things need to tolerate some sort of extreme conditions. Generally, if we think about these pioneer species, they are surviving on almost bare rock. Lichen are one of those sort of species, those pioneer species. Then, once we've got our pioneer species, then we've got to look at our secondary succession. Now this is often things like the mosses. They can manage to survive and basically accumulate some soil, and this organic sort of matter is holds in the water. This makes it easier for other plants to grow, and they're changing here the abiotic to a biotic system. They're breaking down the rocks, releasing some of the minerals, putting soil in there, so we are getting a biotic system. And once this has happened, then we've got the grasses able to come in. And once we've got the grasses, then our next one are our shrubs, and then I suppose eventually our apex system for our climax community, the oak. I talk from a point of view of my country, that I can see that we have got really deciduous oak woodland really around the UK. That's our ultimate community, which forms here, called our Climax Community. So during the succession, there's a number of common features that really come along. We've got to change the abiotic environment to a biotic one. This is by the production of things like soil, and this soil is so important because this enables us to store water, and with soil and with water we're seeing therefore we can get other things happening. So we're getting shelter, and that is going to create what we want, which is basically a habitat, and that's going to lead to niches that in turn can give us increased biodiversity. In the early stages we see little biodiversity, but as time goes by this increases and the biodiversity changes as new species invade. Then some of the pioneer species are literally obliterated, and what we get towards the end then is, for wherever we are, we're getting the dominant species. We have to think that our climax communities are basically here in some sort of stable equilibrium with the environment. They are the perfect plant stroke animal for that particular environment, and just because this is a new environment that's appeared, it's just going to take them a while to sort of establish themselves so that we can get something. We can draw this out as a flow chart, and this might give us some other ideas about how things work. So if I wanted to start here, then we're going to start with basically our barren rock, be it Mount St Helens or maybe Surtsey. We're going to get, first of it all, we're going to get our pioneer colonizers, things like our lichen coming in. This is then going to lead over to our secondary colonizers, which are going to be things like the mosses. This is then going to lead to our tertiary, which is our grasses, and sometimes this is where things stop, but usually I would expect this then to go on to scrubland, as it's called, with all our shrubs that we might want. I suppose we will also include with this all our small trees, and eventually, especially where I live, then we'd end up with our Climax Community, which is going to be, for us here in the UK, woodland. But at any time, what we can do to this is man can interfere. And we can put everything back here to the land being altered. Agriculture can be other things, I suppose, just by animals grazing. Thinking of Australia this year, the fires, and maybe something to do with disease. Where else are we seeing succession in this world? Well, you're going to see a lot of this in your lifetimes as we're going to see our glaciers retreat. If we look at a country such as Greenland, we're seeing the glaciers retreat. As they retreat, then we're going to get all this succession going on, and the climate's going to change because of not just the glaciers retreating, but the succession will also have an effect on the microclimates. So when glaciers melt, they leave behind large gravel deposits known as moraines, and these are going to be places where things are going to grow. So gradually they're going to change. And if I look at a country such as England, around here, Wales, Scotland, then there we've got where the glaciers were, we've got the moraines, we've got the result of this. And so we can imagine that somewhere like Greenland is going to start to see this happening. We talk about Greenland and Iceland, and perhaps they were named the wrong way round by the Vikings when they did this. Greenland largely is a land of ice. But if you look at pictures of Greenland today, it's starting to change. It's starting to become a green land as succession takes place. So we look at the changes, increases of nitrogen, we look at the increases of soil, we look at the increases in plant diversity, and again we're going to look at the increases in then animal diversity as succession continues. I hope that's given you some idea about succession, and if you like that, then please remember to subscribe. I will see you next time when we'll have a look at some more A-level biology topic by topic. Until then, stay safe. Bye bye. Thanks for watching.